Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I want to talk to you about how you can enforce multi-factor authentication in order to grant access to resources to your users in the AWS account. Remember, when you set up an AWS account, you are setting up the root user, the absolute owner of the account. And as part of the setup process, AWS forces you to configure multi-factor authentication for the root user. This means that when you log in as a root user, you have to supply your username and password, as well as a one-time password PIN from your MFA device. You can also ensure that your IAM users use MFA in order to log into the AWS account. And furthermore, you can actually use MFA as a conditional statement in your IAM policies to ensure that certain users are only able to carry out specific actions if and only if they've logged in with their MFA device. So let's take a look at a high-level example. So let's take our good old friend James again. Now he's a member of the senior admins group, which means he's got access to absolutely everything. He can access any bucket he wants. But in addition to that, we could create an additional policy and apply it to James to kind of restrict his so-called admin privileges. So normally you might have James accessing multiple buckets, and we might be happy with him accessing any ordinary richer roast bucket. However, if there is some classified information that we want to make sure that only James can access it, we can ensure that we enforce MFA as a conditional statement for that access. So here we could apply a policy that actually denies access to this bucket. This is the richer roast classified documents bucket, okay, where he can get, put, list, or delete objects from this bucket. These actions are actually denied, unless, of course, he happens to log with multi-factor authentication. And the way how it works is kind of like a bit of like a reverse engineering approach. We're denying access as long as multi-factor authentication is not enabled, as long as James does not log in with multi-factor authentication. This basically means that if we do not set up multi-factor authentication services for James, then this condition statement is essentially true. This condition that multi-factor authentication is not present because of the false element is true. Okay, he is not logged in with multi-factor authentication. As a result of that, if he tries to access the classified bucket, he's just going to be denied access. If we then go in and get James to set up an MFA service using his mobile phone or hardware token or whatever it might be. And so if we apply this policy to James, either directly to James himself or to the senior admins group, which means that James and other members of the senior admin groups will inherit that permission, then James would need to configure himself with multi-factor authentication using an MFA device, either a hardware device or a mobile app or whatever it might be. And then when he logs in with that multi-factor authentication device, he's then able to access that bucket because that condition is no longer applicable. So hopefully this makes a lot of sense. But what you will notice is that this deny statement does not necessarily imply an allow, even if he logs in with a multi-factor authentication. He's only allowed to access the bucket because the senior admins group has an existing permission called administrative access, which gives him access to do everything else. So in other words, James has got two sets of permissions. Let's jump into the AWS Management Console. Let me show you how that works. Okay, so here we are, we're logged in as James into the development account. And as you can see, James is got administrative access because he's a member of the senior admins group. This access gives him the ability to do absolutely everything. However, if you were to add another policy, specifically the deny access policy to that bucket, so here is that policy. So we can see that this is denying all of these actions against this bucket called the richer roast classified docs bucket, as long as the multi-factor authentication present is false. Then James will not be able to access this bucket. You will also note that he's allowed to list the buckets and get bucket location. So we're allowing him to see the list of buckets. We're not denying that. We're not allowing him to access this specific bucket and perform these specific actions on that bucket alone. So if I take this policy now, just copy it to my clipboard, go back and create a new policy. And I'm going to call this one just put in the JSON and just going to paste it in there. Okay. And go ahead and click next, and we'll give this a policy name. We'll call this the ritual roast classified docs permission. Okay, something like that. So it makes a lot of sense. And then we'll go ahead and click create policy. Okay, and then we go back to user groups, go to senior admins, and obviously go to permissions and then add permissions. So attach that policy. So there's the ritual roast classified docs policy. Okay, which obviously is going to deny access to that bucket. Attach policies. And so now what we're basically saying is that the senior admins group, and therefore James, have got both of these policies. And so if we take a look at the administrator access, that gives you access to everything. But then we've got a deny. A deny to perform these actions against these objects as long as you're not logged in with multi-factor authentication. The deny is going to override the allow of the administrator access. Okay, so very quickly, I'm going to sign out of here and sign back in as James. Okay, and you can see that if I go into Amazon S3, I've currently got 3 buckets in there. I can go into the Belly Brew dev, no issues there. I can click on the ritual source code, no issues there. But if I go into the classified docs, you can see that I've got insufficient permissions to list the objects in this bucket. And that is because of that permission that we said that he's not got access to it as long as he doesn't have MFA enabled. So if we go into IAM, and let's just open IAM in a minute, and go to users and James, you'll see James doesn't have MFA access. So we can now go into security credentials, go into MFA and assign an MFA device. And I'm going to call this one James at RR dev. Okay. And we're going to use an authentication app. I'm going to click next. And I'm going to scan the QR code in a minute and go through the process of entering the 2 codes. So I'm not going to show you the QR code, obviously. Okay, so my MFA device has now been added. And so now what I can do is I can log out as James. So I'm just going to sign out and sign back in again. And you'll see it's going to prompt me for my MFA code. So let's go ahead and just log in with the MFA code. 867. And now I'm logging in with MFA code. Okay. So if I go back to IAM and I go back to my user James, you will see that James is enabled with MFA. Okay, great. Let's go into Amazon S3 next. Open that up in another tab. And let's go down to the rituals classified docs. And you can see I now have access to it. I didn't get that error message. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end of this video. I'll see you folks in the next one. Thank you.